The sound of rejection isn't a scream. It isn't a slammed door or a shouted profanity. In my experience, the sound of rejection is much quieter. It is the dry, whispering friction of a single sheet of paper sliding across a polished mahogany table. Shhhk. That was the sound of my life ending. Or at least, the life I thought I wanted. I sat in the boardroom of Sterling and Associates. The air conditioner hummed with a low, expensive purr that smelled faintly of ozone and old money. Across from me sat Julian Thorne. He was 32 years old, heir to a consulting empire, and he wore his arrogance like a second skin, tailored, comfortable, and utterly impenetrable. I was 22. I was wearing a polyester blend suit that I had bought from a clearance rack. It was charcoal gray, slightly too wide in the shoulders, and it retained heat in a way that made me sweat. My hands were folded in my lap, gripping each other so tightly my knuckles were white. I was trying to stop them from shaking. Julian didn't look at me. He was reading my resume. He held the paper with 2 fingers, as if touching it might soil his cuffs. His eyes scanned the text with the bored indifference of a man reading the ingredients on a cereal box he didn't intend to buy. Elias Vance, he said. He didn't ask it. He stated it. Yes, sir, I replied. My voice cracked. I hated myself for it. Julian finally looked up. His eyes were a pale, icy blue, devoid of curiosity. He took off his wire-rimmed glasses and set them on the table. You have spirit, Elias, he said. The way he said spirit made it sound like a disease. You graduated with honors from state. That's commendable. For someone of your background. The qualifier hung in the air. For someone of your background. But let's be realistic, Julian continued, leaning back in his leather chair. The leather creaked, another sound of expensive indifference. Sterling and Associates is a shark tank. We advise Fortune 500 companies on how to eat their competitors. We need predators. We need people who were born in the water. He gestured vaguely at my resume. You are a goldfish, Elias. You are diligent. You are safe. You are perfectly adequate. Adequate. The word landed like a stone in my gut. We don't have the time to be an aquarium, Julian said, offering a tight, practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. Go home. Find a nice mid-level management role in a logistics firm. Be happy with average. There is no shame in being unremarkable. Then came the sound. Shhhk. He slid the resume back across the table. He didn't even watch me pick it up. He had already turned his attention to his phone. I stood up. My legs felt numb. The walk to the door felt like crossing a desert. I wanted to say something, to defend my honor, to scream that I worked 2 jobs to put myself through college, that I knew more about market analysis than he ever would. But I said nothing. I walked out. The elevator ride down to the lobby took 40 seconds. I counted them. When the doors opened and I stepped out onto the bustling street of Charlotte, the humidity hit me like a physical blow. The noise of the city, horns, sirens, chatter, washed over me. I walked 3 blocks to a small park and sat on a bench. I loosened my tie. I looked at the resume in my hand. It was crinkled where I had gripped it. Unremarkable. I didn't cry. Tears are for loss. This wasn't loss. This was clarity. I realized Julian was right. I was a goldfish. I was trying to swim in an ocean I didn't understand, begging for scraps from sharks who didn't even know I existed. But Julian had made a mistake. He assumed that a goldfish couldn't evolve. He assumed that biology was destiny. I took a pen from my pocket. On the back of the resume, I wrote a single sentence. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't a goal. It was a promise to the future version of myself. Success is the only noise I will ever make. I stood up, threw the resume into a trash can, and walked toward the subway. I wasn't going home to sulk. I was going to find a new ocean. The transformation didn't happen in a library. It didn't happen in a graduate school lecture hall. It happened in a scrapyard in New Jersey, 6 months later. I had moved north. I needed to be where the pace was faster, where the noise was louder, so I could learn how to be silent. I had taken a job as an analyst for a salvage company. It was a glorified title for a clerk who tracked inventory in a trailer that smelled of rust and diesel. The owner was a man named Silas. Silas was 60, built like a fire hydrant, with hands that looked like they were carved from oak. He didn't care about my degree. He didn't care about my potential. He cared about copper prices and steel density. "You're overthinking it, kid," Silas told me one afternoon. We were standing by a mountain of twisted metal, the remains of a fleet of delivery trucks. "I'm just trying to categorize the waste," I said, holding my clipboard. "If we separate the aluminum from the steel chassis, we can increase the margin by 4%. Silas spat on the ground. "You're looking at the shape," he said. "Stop looking at the shape. Look at the material. The shape is what it was. The material is what it can be." He walked over to a rusted engine block. "This looks like junk to you. To a buyer in Shanghai, this is raw possibility. They don't see a broken engine. They see the iron. They see the melt." He looked at me, his eyes narrowing under bushy gray brows. "You're like that, Elias. You're walking around worrying about the shape of your suit, the shape of your accent. You're worried you look like scrap." I froze. He had seen right through me. "Stop worrying about what you were," Silas grunted. "Melt yourself down. Separate the copper from the dirt. Figure out what your core material is. Once you know that, the market can't tell you what you're worth. You tell the market." That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my tiny studio apartment, staring at the ceiling. Melt yourself down. I realized I had been trying to imitate the sharks like Julian Thorne. I was trying to wear their suits, talk their talk. But I wasn't a shark. I was something else. I was an architect of value. I started the fund. It wasn't money. It was time. Every hour I wasn't working for Silas, I was studying. But I didn't study standard economics. I studied behavioral psychology. I studied the history of collapsed empires. I studied how silence worked in music, how the pause between notes is often more powerful than the note itself. I stopped talking. I stopped trying to impress people with my intelligence. I became a listener. I learned that when people talk, they reveal their fears. When they brag, they reveal their insecurities. When they are silent, they are calculating. I spent 3 years in that scrapyard. I helped Silas triple his profits, not by working harder, but by analyzing the global supply chain and timing our sales. When I finally handed Silas my resignation letter, he didn't slide it back. He shook my hand. His grip was crushing, warm, and real. "You're done cooking, kid," Silas said. "You're not scrap anymore. You're steel. Go build something." I took the train to New York City the next morning. I didn't buy a new suit. I wore the same one I had, but I had it tailored to fit perfectly. I wasn't going to New York to ask for a job. I was going to New York to solve problems that the sharks were too busy eating each other to see. The lobby of Sterling and Associates hadn't changed. The marble floors were still polished to a mirror shine. The reception desk was still an intimidating slab of black granite. The air still smelled of money. But I had changed. I walked to the security desk. I was wearing a navy bespoke suit from Savile Row, not flashy, but cut with a precision that whispered quality. My shoes were silent on the marble. "Name?" the security guard asked, not looking up. "Elias Vance," I said. My voice was low, steady. A baritone born of a decade of controlling boardrooms. The guard typed it in. He paused. He looked up, his eyes widening slightly. "Mr. Vance, the board is expecting you on the 40th floor." They've been waiting. I know, I said. I'm right on time. The elevator ride up was silent. I watched the numbers climb. 10, 20, 30. I remembered the boy who had counted the seconds on the way down, fighting back tears. I felt a phantom ache in my chest, a memory of that old pain. I acknowledged it, and then I let it go. It was just an echo. The doors opened on the 40th floor. The receptionist stood up immediately. "Mr. Vance, please go right in." I walked down the long corridor. I didn't rush. I observed the art on the walls. Abstract, aggressive, expensive. It was art bought to impress, not to inspire. I pushed open the heavy double doors of the boardroom. The conversation inside stopped instantly. 7 heads turned. At the head of the table sat Julian Thorne. He looked older. The sharp lines of his face had softened into something puffy and tired. There were dark circles under his eyes that no amount of expensive concealer could hide. His silk tie was loosened, a subtle sign of surrender. He looked at me. He frowned. There was no recognition in his eyes. To him, I was just a stranger, a high-priced consultant brought in by the panicked shareholders to stop the bleeding. "Mr. Vance," Julian said, standing up. He didn't offer his hand. He gestured to the empty chair at the opposite end of the table. "We've been discussing the liquidity crisis. We were told you specialize in structural realignment." I walked to the chair. I placed my leather folio on the table. SHHHK. The sound was identical to 10 years ago. But this time, I was the one making it. I didn't sit down. I stood there, letting the silence stretch. I let it fill the room, heavy and thick. I watched Julian fidget. I watched him check his watch. I watched the bead of sweat form on his temple. "I don't specialize in realignment, Julian," I said softly. Julian blinked. The use of his first name was a violation of protocol. It was a power move. "I specialize in foundations," I continued. "And yours is rotting." "Excuse me." Julian bristled, his old arrogance trying to flare up like a dying ember. "We are Sterling and Associates. We are a pillar of this industry. We are merely facing a temporary market headwind." "You are facing a hurricane in a paper boat," I said. "I've read the financials. I've read the hidden ledgers you tried to bury in the Cayman accounts. You aren't just losing money, Julian. You're losing your soul." The room went deathly quiet. Julian stared at me. He squinted, tilting his head slightly. He was searching his memory bank, looking for a file that matched my face. Do I know you?" he asked. His voice was smaller now. I smiled. It wasn't a cruel smile. It was the smile of a teacher looking at a student who has finally asked the right question. "No, primelit. You met a boy 10 years ago. He's gone. I'm what came after." I pulled out a chair and finally sat down. "Now," I said, locking eyes with him, "let's talk about how to save the people in this building that you haven't fired yet." Julian sat down slowly. He looked defeated. He didn't know it yet, but the shark tank had just been drained. And the goldfish was breathing just fine. A balance sheet is not just a list of numbers. It is a confession. If you know how to listen, the numbers will tell you exactly what a man is afraid of. I spent the next 48 hours in a glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor. I didn't sleep. I didn't leave the building. I had a pot of black coffee and 3 boxes of Julian's archived files. The staff at Sterling and Associates watched me like I was a bomb technician defusing a live explosive. They whispered near the water cooler, their eyes darting toward the glass. They knew something was wrong, but they didn't know the depth of the rot. I did. By 3 a.m. on the second night, I had found the tumor. It wasn't just market volatility, as Julian had claimed. It was a project codenamed Aurora. Julian had funneled $40 million into a luxury waterfront development in Miami. It was a vanity project, a glittering monument to his own ego. But the zoning permits had been denied 2 years ago. The project was dead. The land was swamp. Yet, on the books, Aurora was listed as an asset worth $60 million. Julian wasn't just incompetent. He was a fraud. He had been using high-interest bridge loans to pay the interest on previous loans, using the inflated value of the swamp as collateral. It was a classic Ponzi scheme, disguised as corporate strategy. I sat back in my chair and rubbed my eyes. The city lights of Charlotte flickered below me, indifferent and beautiful. I felt a strange lack of anger. Anger requires surprise. I wasn't surprised. This was exactly what happened when a man defined his worth by what he built, rather than who he was. Julian built towers on mud because he felt like mud inside. At 8 a.m., the board convened again. Julian looked worse than before. His skin had the gray, pasty quality of wet dough. He knew I had the files. "The audit is complete," I said, placing a single sheet of paper in the center of the table. "And?" asked Mrs. Gable, the matriarch of the board. She was 70, sharp-eyed, and wore pearls that cost more than my parents' house. "The firm is technically insolvent," I said. My voice was flat, devoid of judgment. "Project Aurora is a ghost. The assets are non-existent. And the bridge loan from the Chicago group, the one Julian signed to cover the losses, it has a bad boy clause." "What does that mean?" Mrs. Gable asked, her voice trembling slightly. I looked at Julian. He was staring at his hands. "It means," I said, "that if the firm misses a single payment, the lender doesn't just get the money. They get the equity. They get the firm. And that payment is due tomorrow at noon." The silence that followed wasn't the silence of power. It was the silence of a funeral. "Who is the lender?" Mrs. Gable whispered. "Paul Henderson," I said. The name sucked the oxygen out of the room. Everyone knew Henderson. He was a corporate scavenger. He didn't lend money to help companies survive. He lent money to help them die so he could sell the organs. "We're finished," Julian murmured. "He'll strip us for parts." "He intends to," I agreed. I stood up and walked to the window. But Henderson makes a common mistake. He assumes that because he is a shark, everyone else is seal meat. I turned back to the terrified room. I'm going to meet him. And I'm going to remind him that even sharks have predators. Paul Henderson didn't have an office. He worked out of a private club in Uptown, a place where the leather was distressed and the whiskey was older than the Constitution. He agreed to see me at 11 a.m. He kept me waiting for 45 minutes. It was a power play. A cheap one. When I was finally ushered into his private booth, Henderson didn't stand up. He was eating a steak, rare. He was a large man, with a face that looked like it had been punched a few times in a previous life. He wore a suit that was expensive but ill-fitting, straining at the buttons. "You're the new fixer," Henderson said, chewing slowly. He didn't offer me a seat. "Vance, right? Heard you used to work in a scrapyard." "I still do," I said. "The scrap just looks different now." Henderson laughed. It was a wet, unpleasant sound. "Look, Vance. I know why you're here. You want an extension. You want to beg. Save your breath. The contract is ironclad. Sterling and Associates belongs to me at 12:01 p.m. tomorrow." I sat down, uninvited. I placed my hands on the table. No trembling. No white knuckles. Just stillness. "I'm not here to beg, Paul. And I'm certainly not here to ask for an extension." Henderson paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. "Then why are you wasting my lunch hour?" "I'm here to discuss usury," I said. The word hung in the air between us, heavy and dangerous. Henderson put down his fork. His eyes narrowed. Watch yourself, boy. My contracts are vetted by the best lawyers in Chicago. I'm sure they are, I said calmly. But you got greedy, Paul. You bundled the default interest with the penalty fees. When you compound them, the effective annual percentage rate hits 48%. I leaned in slightly. In the state of North Carolina, the cap for commercial loans of this structure is 45%. Anything above that isn't just a breach of contract. It's a felony. Henderson's face turned a shade of red that clashed with the burgundy leather of the booth. You're bluffing, he sneered. No judge will side with a bankrupt firm against a secured creditor. Maybe not, I conceded. But the SEC will. And the state attorney general? He's running for re-election on an anti-corruption platform. Handing him the head of a predatory Chicago lender, that would be quite the campaign poster. I saw it then. The flicker. The tiny micro-expression of fear behind his eyes. It lasted less than a second, but it was there. The shark had blinked. What do you want? Henderson growled. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the cold calculation of a man realizing he had stepped into a trap. I want the debt restructured, I said. Principal plus 5%. No equity. No takeover. And you signed the release forms today. 5%. Henderson slammed his hand on the table. That's charity. No, Paul, I said, standing up. That's the exit fee. You can take the 5% and walk away with a profit. Or you can take the firm, and I'll spend the next 3 years burying you in litigation that will expose every other dirty loan you've written in this state. I checked my watch. You have an hour. I'll be at the bar. Waiting is an art form. I sat at the bar of the private club, nursing a club soda. I didn't check my phone. I didn't look back at the booth where Henderson was furiously making calls to his lawyers. The bartender, a man with kind eyes and a scar on his chin, wiped the counter. You look like a man who just bet the house, he noted. No, I said, watching the bubbles rise in my glass. I just bet someone else's house. I thought about Julian. I thought about the way he had dismissed me 10 years ago. You are a goldfish. He was right. But he forgot that a goldfish in a small bowl grows to the size of the bowl. A goldfish in a lake grows to the size of the lake. I was no longer in a bowl. At 12:45 p.m., Henderson's lawyer, a thin, nervous man with a briefcase that looked too heavy for him, approached the bar. He placed a folder on the counter next to my drink. Mr. Henderson accepts the terms, the lawyer said. His voice was tight. But he wants you to know that you have made a powerful enemy today. I picked up the folder. I didn't open it. I knew the papers were signed. Tell Mr. Henderson, I said, looking at the lawyer's reflection in the mirror behind the bar, that enemies are just potential assets I haven't acquired yet. I paid for my club soda, tipped the bartender $100, and walked out. When I returned to Sterling and Associates, the boardroom was exactly as I had left it. The board members were still sitting there, frozen in a tableau of panic. Julian was staring out the window, looking like a man awaiting execution. I tossed the folder onto the mahogany table. SHHHK. The sound again. But this time, it was the sound of a key turning in a lock. It's done, I said. The takeover is off. Henderson settled. Mrs. Gable gasped. Julian spun around, his eyes wide with disbelief. How? Julian stammered. What did you give him? I gave him a choice, I said. The only thing a man like Henderson respects. I looked at Julian. For the first time, I didn't see the monster of my youth. I saw a small, frightened man in a suit that no longer fit the reality of his life. But this isn't a victory, Julian, I said, my voice hardening. This is a reprieve. You kept the company, but you lost the right to lead it. I pulled a second document from my folio. This one I had drafted myself. This is a resignation letter, I said, sliding it toward him. Effective immediately. You will step down as CEO. You will retain your shares, but you will have no voting power. The board will appoint an interim director until a restructuring team, my team, can vet a replacement. Julian looked at the paper. Then he looked at me. And if I refuse? He asked weakly. Then I call Henderson back, I said. And I tell him I made a mistake about the interest rate. It was a bluff. I would never have done it. But Julian didn't know that. He lived in a world of transactions, where loyalty was a currency that fluctuated with the market. He couldn't conceive of a man who operated on principle. Julian picked up the gold pen. His hand shook. He signed. As he capped the pen, he looked at me with a mixture of hatred and awe. "Who are you really?" he whispered. I picked up the resignation letter. I didn't smile. "I'm the average applicant," I said. "I'm the goldfish." I turned and walked out of the boardroom. I didn't look back. There was no need. The structure had been corrected. The silence had done its work. As the elevator doors closed, I finally allowed myself a deep breath. My hands were steady. My heart was slow. I took out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. "Silas," I said when the old man picked up. "I found some scrap. It's high quality. We can melt it down." "Good," Silas grunted. "Get back to work." I smiled. The real work was just beginning. Power is not about holding the throne. It is about building the castle. I didn't stay at Sterling and Associates. Once the interim director was installed, a woman named Sarah Jenkins, who had been overlooked for promotion 3 times despite running the most profitable division, I packed my folio. I didn't need the corner office. I didn't need the title. I had what I came for: closure. I took the consulting fee, a sum that would have seemed astronomical to the boy in the polyester suit, and I bought a small derelict warehouse in the artistic district of Noda. The brick was exposed, the floors were scarred, and the lighting was industrial. It was perfect. I hung a small sign on the door. "No gold lettering. No logo." Just 3 words in plain black type: the Goldfish Incubator. My thesis was simple. The corporate world was obsessed with pedigree. They hired from the same 5 universities, looked for the same keywords on resumes, and wore the same brands of watches. They were cloning themselves. And clones have a fatal flaw: they share the same blind spots. I began to recruit. But I didn't post ads on LinkedIn. I went to community college hackathons. I sat in the back of night school lectures. I looked for the stutterers, the introverts, the ones who didn't make eye contact but whose notebooks were filled with chaotic brilliance. One rainy Tuesday, a young woman named Maya walked in. She was wearing a hoodie and carrying a laptop covered in stickers. She didn't have a resume. She had a flash drive. "They said you invest in weird things," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I invest in undervalued assets," I corrected. "Sit down." Maya didn't sit. She plugged the drive into my monitor. I wrote a code that predicts supply chain disruptions based on weather patterns and social media sentiment. I tried to show it to a VC firm in Silicon Valley. They asked me where I went to school. When I told them I was self-taught, the meeting ended. I watched the screen. The code wasn't just functional, it was elegant. It was a symphony of logic. "Why didn't you lie?" I asked. "You could have said you went to MIT. They wouldn't have checked until after the seed round." Maya looked at me, offended. "Because the code is true. If I have to lie about who I am to sell it, then the buyer isn't smart enough to own it." I smiled. It was the first genuine smile I had felt in months. "How much do you need?" I asked. 200,000, she said, bracing herself for a negotiation. "I'll give you 500, I said. "But you have to hire 3 people who look exactly like you, people the world thinks are invisible." The Goldfish Incubator wasn't just a venture capital firm. It was an army. And while the sharks and the high-rises were fighting over blood in the water, we were quietly building a new ocean. Success in Charlotte is loud. Success in London is a whisper. 6 months after launching the incubator, I received a letter. It was on heavy cream-colored paper with no letterhead. The handwriting was elegant and sharp, like the scratch of a fountain pen on parchment. You have conquered the pond, Elias. But the ocean is calling. Come to London. The game here is played with different pieces. Elena. My mentor. The woman who had taught me that silence was a weapon. I hadn't seen her since I left Wall Street. I booked a one-way ticket. London greeted me with a persistent gray drizzle and the smell of ancient stone and diesel. If New York is a sprint, London is a marathon run in a bespoke suit. The power here wasn't in the skyscrapers. It was in the private clubs of Mayfair and the quiet townhouses of Kensington. I met Elena at the Wolseley for tea. She looked exactly as I remembered, timeless. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her eyes were like polished obsidian. You look different, she said, setting down her porcelain cup. Less hungry. More dangerous. I'm full, I said. I ate a shark. She laughed softly. Julian Thorne. A small fish in a small pond. But you didn't come here to reminisce about Charlotte, did you? No, I said. I came because you told me the game was bigger here. It is, she said, her expression turning serious. In America, money buys power. In England, class buys access, and access buys money. You can be a billionaire here and still be a nobody if you don't know the right handshake. She gestured to a table across the room. A group of men in Savile Row suits were laughing quietly. They didn't look aggressive. They looked comfortable. See that man in the center? The one with the silver tie? Elena asked. Yes. That is Alastair Heath, senior partner at Sterling Vaughan, the parent company of the firm you just dismantled. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty door. He knows who you are, Elena continued. And in London, they don't get angry when you humiliate their family. They get even. But they do it politely. They will invite you to dinner, pour you the finest wine, and bankrupt you before the dessert arrives. I looked at Alastair Heath. He caught my eye. He didn't scowl. He raised his glass in a mock toast. Let him try, I said, picking up my tea. I prefer English food anyway. The first attack didn't come from a lawsuit. It came from a rumor. 2 weeks after my arrival, I was setting up the London branch of the incubator in Shoreditch. I was scheduled to meet with a potential investor, a tech mogul named Sir Richard. He cancelled 10 minutes before the meeting. No explanation. Then, a bank loan I had pre-approved for a new office space was suddenly retracted. Compliance issues, the manager told me over the phone, his voice sounding rehearsed. I was being ghosted. Systematically. I sat in my hotel room in Mayfair, looking at the rain streaking the window. This was the architecture of silence turned against me. They weren't fighting me, they were erasing me. They were closing the doors and waiting for me to suffocate. I realized I couldn't play by their rules. I couldn't buy access. I had to hack it. I spent 3 nights analyzing the portfolio of Sterling Vaughan. They were heavy in traditional industries: mining, shipping, insurance. Old money. Slow money. But they had a weakness. They were terrified of obsolescence. They were terrified of being left behind by the very thing I specialized in: the new, the weird, the goldfish. I decided to host a dinner. But not at a private club. I rented an abandoned tube station tunnel in South London. I filled it with avant-garde art, hired a molecular gastronomy chef, and sent out invitations printed on circuit boards. The invitation was simple: you own the past. Come see who owns the future. I invited the children. The rebellious sons of dukes, the tech-savvy daughters of bankers, the black sheep of the elite families who felt stifled by tradition. I knew that in London, if you can't get to the king, you talk to the prince. By 9 p.m., the tunnel was packed. The bass of underground techno shook the dust from the ceiling. And there, standing by a holographic display of Maya's supply chain code, was Marcus Thorne, Julian's cousin. He wasn't like Julian. He was sharper, leaner, and his eyes held a predatory intelligence that Julian never possessed. He walked over to me, holding a glass of champagne that cost more than my first car. "You have a flair for the dramatic, Mr. Vance," Marcus said. His accent was clipped, polished to a shine. "I find drama is necessary when people refuse to answer their phones," I replied. Marcus smirked. "Alistair thinks you're a nuisance. A colonial upstart." "And what do you think?" I asked. "I think you're dangerous," Marcus said, taking a sip. "You destroyed Julian. He was an idiot, but he was our idiot. You embarrassed the family." "I saved the family firm," I corrected. "Irrelevant," Marcus said. "You broke the code. And now you're here, trying to steal our children with techno music and flashing lights." "I'm not stealing them, Marcus," I said, gesturing to the crowd of young elites who were captivated by the startups I was showcasing. "I'm offering them something you can't." "And what is that?" "Relevance." Marcus's smile vanished. He stepped closer. "Enjoy your party, Elias. But tomorrow, the hangover begins. You think you can disrupt London? We've survived the plague, the Blitz, and the financial crash. We will survive you." "Survival is a low bar," I said. "I'm not here to survive. I'm here to evolve." Marcus turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. But I saw him make a call on his phone as he left. The war had officially begun. And this time, the enemy wasn't sleeping. Marcus Thorne didn't fight like a soldier, he fought like a bank. He didn't try to kill you, he tried to starve you. 3 weeks after our confrontation in the tunnel, the pattern became undeniable. Every startup I approached, every goldfish I tried to incubate, was suddenly swarmed by offers from Apex Global, Marcus's venture arm. If I offered a seed round of 200,000, Marcus offered 2 million. If I offered mentorship, he offered global distribution. He was buying everything I touched, not because he wanted it, but because he wanted to make sure I couldn't have it. I sat in my office in Shoreditch, looking at a whiteboard covered in red crosses. "We lost the drone logistics company this morning," Maya said, typing furiously on her laptop. "And the vertical farming startup just returned our term sheet. Apex offered them triple the valuation." "He's bleeding us," I said quietly. "He knows we can't compete on capital. He's trying to price us out of the market." "It's not just pricing," Maya said, turning her screen toward me. "It's surveillance. Look at the metadata on our server logs. Every time we send an email to a founder, there's a ping from a server cluster in the Isle of Man. They're tracking our interest in real time." I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the London rain was relentless. Marcus was playing a game of attrition. He had deep pockets, old money, centuries of it. He could afford to overpay for mediocrity just to keep me from finding excellence. He thought he was hunting me. But he had forgotten the first rule of hunting: if you focus too hard on the prey, you lose sight of the terrain. "Maya," I said, turning back to the whiteboard. "Stop securing our servers. Let them watch." "What?" Maya looked at me as if I had lost my mind. "If they want to see what we're looking at," I said, a cold smile forming on my lips, "let's give them a show." I picked up a marker and wrote 2 words on the board: Project Icarus. "We're going to find a company that looks like a rocket ship," I said. "Something loud. Something shiny. Something that promises to change the world but has absolutely no engine inside." "And then?" Maya asked. "And then," I said, we're going to make Marcus Thorne buy it. We found our decoy in a coffee shop in Soho. The company was called OmniStream. It billed itself as a decentralized AI content aggregator. It had a slick website, a charismatic founder with a man bun who used the word paradigm every 3 sentences, and absolutely no proprietary technology. It was a wrapper, a hollow shell built on open source code. It was perfect. I began the performance. I started visiting the OmniStream offices. I made sure I was photographed leaving with thick binders tucked under my arm. I had Maya create encrypted internal memos, praising the company as the next Google, knowing full well that Marcus's team would intercept them. I even staged a lunch with the founder at a restaurant where I knew Alastair Heath, Marcus's uncle, dined every Tuesday. I leaned in close, speaking in hushed, excited tones, pointing at charts that meant nothing. The bait was in the water. 2 days later, the water rippled. I was in my office when my phone rang. It was the founder of OmniStream. He sounded breathless. "Elias, look, I know we have a handshake agreement," he stammered. "But, well, things have moved fast. We just received an unsolicited offer." "From whom?" I asked, feigning shock. "Apex Global. They're offering a Series A of 20 million. At a pre-money valuation of 100 million. I held the phone away from my ear for a second to suppress a laugh. 100 million for a website wrapper. Marcus wasn't just biting, he was swallowing the hook, the line, and the sinker. That's aggressive," I said, injecting a note of panic into my voice. "Listen, give me 24 hours. I can try to restructure our deal." "I don't think I can wait," the founder said. "They want an answer by close of business." "Fine," I sighed, sounding defeated. "I can't match that numbers. You have to do what's right for your company." I hung up. Maya was watching me from across the desk. "He bought it." "He bought it," I confirmed. "So we just cost him $20 million, Maya grinned. "No," I said, picking up my coat. "We distracted him. While he was busy chasing the shiny object, he stopped watching the dull one." I pulled a file from my drawer. It wasn't digital. It was paper, old, yellowed, and boring. "Come on," I said. "We have a meeting in the basement of a utility building in Croydon. It's time to buy the real asset." While Marcus Thorne was popping champagne over his acquisition of OmniStream, I was sitting in a windowless room that smelled of stale coffee and ozone. Across from me sat Mr. Henderson, no relation to the shark in Charlotte. He was a tired man in a grey cardigan, the CEO of London Subterranean Fibre. His company was boring. It owned 50 miles of dark fiber-optic cables running beneath the financial district. It was infrastructure laid in the 90s and largely forgotten. To the market, it was a low-yield utility stock. To me, it was the carotid artery of the London Stock Exchange. "I must admit, Mr. Vance," the old man said, polishing his spectacles, "we don't get much interest from venture capitalists. We're not disruptive." "Disruption is a myth, Mr. Henderson," I said, reading the contract. "Physics is real. Light travels at a constant speed. And your cables offer the straightest line between the exchange servers and the data centers in Slough." "Well, yes," he said. "But the maintenance costs are high." "I'm aware," I said. "I'm not buying the company for the maintenance. I'm buying it for the latency." I knew something Marcus didn't. High-frequency trading algorithms, the kind Apex Global used to generate their billions, relied on speed. Milliseconds matter. And London Subterranean Fibre owned the physical right-of-way that Apex rented. By buying this company, I wouldn't just be owning a utility. I would be owning the toll road that Marcus drove his Ferrari on. I signed the papers. The acquisition cost was $12 million, barely half of what Marcus had just wasted on the fake AI company. "Done," Mr. Henderson said, stamping the document. You are now the majority shareholder. I walked out into the cool London air. My phone buzzed. It was an email from Marcus. Subject: better luck next time. Body: the market speaks, Elias. OmniStream is the future. Try to keep up. I didn't reply. I simply forwarded the email to Maya with a single instruction. Draft a notice to all tenants of the LSF fiber network. Inform them that due to necessary infrastructure upgrades, transit fees will increase by 400% effective next quarter. I hailed a black cab. As I settled into the leather seat, I watched the skyscrapers of Canary Wharf drift by. They looked tall and imposing, but I knew the truth. They were just glass boxes sitting on top of my cables. The goldfish hadn't just survived the tank. The goldfish had just bought the water filter.